Shall we play a game?
We got one person online. The workload is enough for like 10 users. I think we got a hacker.
Shall we play a game?
What are they doing to him? Breaking into his mind. It's like hacking a computer. All it takes is time.
Red alert! All hands to battle stations.
Hello, friend.
Welcome to Red Spy 365.
Shall we play a game?
Welcome. So, I'm going to do a kind of a series. I've decided that, I think I need about 10, 12, 13, just kind of podcasts talking about Red Spy in general, talking about this, the security market. And I'll go through, the different various topics, but I'm trying to be a little bit more formalized. And I apologize for not making as much content, but it has been crazy. I mean, if I look back and think, wow, this has been such a busy period, but it's kind of leveled off, which is good. We like leveling off. I like the work. I love doing what I'm doing, but I don't want to work every waking moment. All work and no play makes Jack a very dull boy. And on top of which, you kind of think of if I want to chop down a tree, I'm going to spend twice as long sharpening the axe, that kind of thing. So you also want to get your own skills and understand what's going on in the industry so you can tailor your attacks and look at, because let's face it, we work in an industry that changes so fast that if you don't keep up with it, you're using tactics of, 5 weeks ago might not be good enough. There might be a whole new thing out. And so I have a number of sites that I go to, and I really should. In fact, I'm going to make that into a talk one time about where I search and what I look for and who I think I follow and that kind of thing, just to make sure that, because you can tell me actually if I'm missing out. You might have better ones than me, and if you do, feel free to tell me. So this project or this podcast is going to be the reason for Red Spy, the backstory. I've done a number of webinars and I guess I talked about how it came about, but you may have missed them. And let's face it, if you're not on a webinar all the time, some of us actually work for a living, so you might not have had a chance to. So I'm just going to put this out there, not necessarily for posterity, but really just to sort of say how this came about. And the backstory to this is actually it's sort of a culmination of things. It wasn't just an overnight light bulb moment. But I was at DEF CON, and I was at Black Hat doing the Arsenal section. And at Black Hat, at the time I was doing ISOL. So, I was working at a college, and I was working on an ISOL project, and I was looking at how I can integrate it with IRC and how it, alerting on people clicking and, just basically creating a phishing program, but not just a phishing program, one that would actually not just worry about just collecting clicks, but I could deliver payloads, I could clone pages, I could capture credentials. So at the time, bearing in mind, we're talking now, 8-9 years ago, there wasn't a great deal of free stuff out there for sure on the phishing side of things. It really wasn't. And even with, the phishing side of the area, I wanted to be able to, when someone clicks, take a user agent, redirect them based upon user agent and source IP. So there was a lot more to it than just, the traditional, hey, these bunch of users got sent this email and these bunch of people clicked. That's fine. And even then for the day, that was okay. But what I was doing was, and I remember walking around at Black Hat, and there was a couple of vendors out there, I'm not going to name them, but I walked up to them and I said, wouldn't it be cool though if it wasn't just collecting the clicks, but you was able to do the credentials and then reuse those credentials to see if you could log in or put a payload in it and then do post exploitation. And I'm like, yeah, that sounds great, but it sounds too complicated. And so rather than, I could have gone two ways at that point. I could have really focused on just the clicks and the training, which is kind of ironic because that's part and parcel of what I'm looking at right now is how to obviously re-educate users. but I really wanted to put the teeth into it. So there I was sitting there thinking, okay, ISOL's doing good, and then Raphael Mudge, guy that a fucking genius that wrote Cobalt Strike, as far as I'm concerned, the user of Armitage and everything, but he was doing a talk called Rise of the Red Team, and so I was sitting in the audience, and he was talking about how this, post-exploitation, this was a DARPA-funded Cortana scripting language, blah blah blah, and I was sitting there thinking, man, that kind of tallies with exactly what I could do. That is that's doable now. I can sit there with Cortana scripts. Now, bearing in mind, I am not a programmer. I can do scripting, and he was in his sleep language, and I was like, okay. And the cool thing about Raphael was, I could email him, and he would, help me out, point me in the right direction. Obviously, the dude was a bit busy to help. Well, actually, the dude wasn't as busy because he would actually even help me. That's, he would actually help me with the script. So. And I remember sitting there thinking, okay, I've got all the pieces now, all the jigsaw puzzles starting to fall together. I could see everything coming through. So I was still doing what I consider traditional pen testing. These are the one-off photographs, and I think they're great. That any kind of photograph you do, or any kind of pen test you do helps. Because it's coming from that bottom-up approach. In other words, we're not caring about what you say you are; we're looking at what you actually are. And I done a test, and about 4 weeks later, I think it was, that company was breached, and I was lucky enough to be part of the breach investigation. Partly because I was like, man, did I miss something? So if you're ever a pen tester, you get paranoid that you miss either obvious stuff or unobvious stuff, or maybe someone's done something. You just want to absorb everything. You just want to know. I guess you just want to learn. Shakespeare 2.0 is not going to come out tomorrow, but we definitely know that just learning is everything for us. And what was interesting to me was, 4 weeks prior, they looked pretty good. Well, 2 weeks after I'd done the test, there was a Struts 2 exploit out. And, literally, they was found to be obviously vulnerable, and someone compromised them. And I was like, man, this is good. I mean, pen testing is good, but there's got to be a better way. We've got to be able to move it from this photograph into this movie. And so initially my idea was that you would do a test, like we do with Red Spy, we onboard, it's an initial test. And then you're looking at those delta changes. What changes in an organization or outside an organization to alter the risk and identify that risk and show impact. That to me was like a key part of it. I wanted to look at where the risk was and how it changed and what the impact of the organization. Because if you go back to what pen testing is, really, you see it's, to, validate the vulnerabilities and to ensure and to check impact to the organization. And, the other tag is that, to test the assurance of the defenses in place, which, is good. But that's a one-off approach. And when you move to that continuous testing, you go from being a photographer to a movie director. And that was, to be honest, that was like the light bulb moment, how we do that. And I'm going to do a whole talk about discovery and how that works. In fact, I might do that next, because I think that's, to be honest, it's really interesting for me. And, there's some challenges, not just in the tools, because don't forget, we're now trying to use these tools continuously that were never designed to be used continuously. And some of them were never coded to be used continuously, to be honest, because they fall over and we've had to make changes to them ourselves just to keep them up. But the idea is that we want to be able to do this continuously. So moving from that philosophy of a photographer to this movie director. So when I was, I already, I saw everything coming together, and this is where like 1.0 come to be. And even then I thought, okay, this is just going to be in addition to pen testing. Like you would do the one-off, you would do your pen test, and then you would run this tool or this service on an organization, and it would tell me the changes and, how I could then literally look at the changes. And really at the time, 1.0 for Red Spy was basically ISOL, the email phishing program. Because I always believe, phishing is like, number one attack vector. It's, was at the time, and it probably still is. So we were looking at the attack vectors and what we could do. And really, what we were looking at there was, we got the fishing, and you had, and I say we, it's the royal we, it's just me in a hotel room half the time. But I was doing ones where I was sending out a fish and clicking on that fish, and it sort of triggering something. So I'd kind of like, at the time I was using sort of the Cortana scripting and Cobalt Strike and Armitage to do the external threat surface while I could do the fishing with it, and that was like, it worked. I was like, okay, this could happen. But really, the big breakthrough for me, the big breakthrough that I looked at was how could we pass information from maybe the scripting language, maybe from Cortana, from the IRC, from the ISOL system into the portal, from Cortana into the portal. And the good thing was, like, Raphael stuff was always talking IRC, and Raphael was big on IRC. I was big on IRC, and so those two kind of melded nicely together. And what I looked at was, this is an event. What happens is an event. Not every event needs something to happen, but the event could work. And the reason I stuck on IRC, and looking back, maybe I could have gone to XMP, or just there was different protocols out there, Node.js, there's different ways that I could do this. And the reason why I liked IRC was, because it's like bomb-proof. After Armageddon, IRC channels are still going to be around. And, you can still look at things like, Node.js was, Slack, earlier versions of Slack. Or basically that kind of, the ability to pass multimedia may at some point I may look for another channel, not just for IRC. I may look at something like, a Node.js or my own kind of special channel, because I think there's definitely improvement there can be made from just IRC. And obviously, if you start moving into those kind of areas, then you may have the ability to not just pass sort of tags around or information on tags, but you can pass multimedia files around, which is something very different. But going back, to the backstory, there was that we had this, so I created like 1.0 in a hotel room. Actually, I was at a conference, and it wasn't the DEF CON Black Hat conference, but I was just at a conference. I was doing a talk, and in that evening I sat there and I was just working on the scripting language and how it worked, and I was like, this is awesome. Then I started integrating the phishing side, and that was awesome too. And so I saw the possibilities there. And really, the bigger picture for me was the event action trigger, the bots. Because I was like, this is great. Sitting there creating Cortana scripting language is fantastic. But what if you're not a coder? What if, you don't want to learn how to script? And I remember back in the day, when I first left the military, I was I was an analyst, but I was working on the web side of things. And if you was to use, sort of Dreamweaver when it first came out, you was a heretic in the web industry. If you was to use, you had to use Notepad, because it's like, man, it's just like Dreamweaver just adds so much junk to it. It takes download longer. And it was really like, no, but now we build websites in websites. It was always, the idea was never the how you got there. I mean, it was important, but it was also, what you was creating. So, I could create multiple websites and pretty good websites by using Dreamweaver in a fraction of the time that you would sit there typing this up in code. Then, to be honest, you won. This made no sense. And so it kind of, I go back and I always hark back to that. Got to make it easy, not necessarily for anybody just to walk up and run a pen test. That's not what we're designed to do. I always turn around and say, I want the intuitive things that are needed by a pen tester to continue. Sometimes, not everything is automated. Bots and automation is great at repetitive tasks. Interpretive functionality is really poor at. And so when I was looking at it, I was like, okay, how could I get this so that, we can create something but it's got to be as flexible, but not necessarily as coding. So remember, at this point, I've basically got, the foundation of 1.0, which is, ISOL and Cortana. And I'm not a developer, so I've got my friend Pradip, and I've known him. We've done a lot of projects together, and so I went to him and was talking about it, and it's when 1.0 Portal first came out. I really should have. I think I've got it somewhere. I might ask Pradip for it because it shows how from where we were to. Sometimes you forget you get so stuck in the moment that you forget to turn around and say, "Wow, we have come a long way." In reality, I always think there's still a long way to go. I'm never quite satisfied. But I think when we get to certain versions, like we've got 13.4 coming up, that's a milestone for me. 13.4 I think is a big milestone for Red Spy. But we had this 1.0, and so I thought about how can I make it so that we're now making it easy for people to do. And I always had this tags. Systems are going to talk tags. I've worked in electronic intelligence for a long time, and so to me, tags are how we pass communications, and especially in comms, how communications work. Tags, routing tags. We use these kind of things, these identifiers for events. And so, when I started thinking about tags and how events work, I thought to myself, okay, I can use a tag, in other words, an identifier of an event, specifically, to trigger other actions. And so I started thinking about, event, action, trigger. And, sometimes I think about it, and maybe I should have called it trigger, action, event, but, hey, it is what it is. I like it. Sometimes it's not totally intuitive. Sometimes I think to myself, okay, maybe, might revisit that back in the past. But to be honest, an event occurs. And we're able to take that event. So this is the way I was thinking at the time. I can take that event, pass it to an action, and have that action trigger a response back to either the IRC or to the email or to the user, to the end user. And now we're adding things like in Slack and Jira, and so the trigger to me is it's the result of the event and action. How do I want it to do? Or maybe I want it to trigger something else. And that's the thinking at the time was that maybe a trigger might not necessarily just be an email or an IRC action or a Slack action or anything like that. It might be something a lot more deeper. It might trigger something. So that's really why trigger came about. So I had this, at that point, you've got the foundation there. You have ISOL, which I'm like, okay, I was quite confident with, I was quite happy with. In fact, when I'd done it, it was just a free tool. You can still go on and download some of the earlier versions. I was quite worried actually, because I started seeing it appear in you'd do a search for ISOL and you'd see them in Chinese sites. And I was like, well, maybe, and every time you make a tool, you think, I don't want it to be used for bad. I want it to be used for good, especially if you don't want it to be used against us. That's for sure. But then I started seeing it, and so I thought to myself, I'm not going to open source this anymore. At that point, that's when I made the decision. People were doing bad things with things, with the tools that was being created. It's not like it was a tool that could be used only for good. You could use it also for bad. But I was quite confident at the time that it wasn't that exciting, and there was other ones coming up and coming, so they'll probably use those guys rather than mine. So, my faith in my tool at that time wasn't the best. I was just thinking the bad guys would use other people's tools, not mine, because it was probably coded better at the time. Well, not necessarily coded better. That's wrong. It was, mine was from a continuous, and it was, so you got to understand where it was going to at the time. But yeah, so we had the foundation, we had ISOL, we had the Cortana scripting, we had the foundation for event action trigger, and that was 1.0. So I would do the test and I would then point all these things off and have the alerts looking for any changes to the static threat surface, but also have the ability to run phish campaigns. That was the 1.0. At this point, we wasn't even integrating vulnerability scanners. We wasn't even integrating, web applications. The actual event and actions were so basic, but it was the foundation block. So I thought that's where I would take you. Just the reason for Red Spy, obviously trying to move from that photograph to a movie, and also address because let's face it, from one pen test to another, a lot of things change, and you want to really understand the risk early on. The earlier you understand the risk to the organization, the more likely you are to respond to that risk, or the more valuable that information is to you. So that's kind of like where Red Spy, what I was trying to get at early on, and to show that impact as well of that risk. So thanks for listening, and hopefully that's a little bit more of the backstory of Red Spy. I used to sit up there. I used to do a test, and I would sit in the hotel rooms to 11, 12, 1 in the morning, working on either scripting or working, just sitting down, jotting ideas. I had like pages and pages that I would go through of just like diagrams and drawing it up and what I think it should do and how it should look. But it was very, very inspirational at the time. So thanks very much for listening, and hopefully next time we'll talk about discovery and how we struggle with identifying what's important to us. So thanks very much.
Shall we play a game?
We got one person online. The workload is enough for like 10 users. I think we got a hacker.
Shall we play a game?
What are they doing to him? Breaking into his mind. It's like hacking a computer. All it takes is time.
Red alert. All hands to battle stations.
Hello, friend.
Welcome to Red Spy 365.
Shall we play a game?